The kitchen smelled like the coffee I'd been drinking every morning for 31 years. Dark roast, 2 sugars, no milk, and I was on my second cup when my daughter-in-law walked in and changed everything. She didn't say good morning. She didn't ask how I'd slept. Sandra set her handbag on the counter with the particular kind of deliberateness that tells you a conversation has been rehearsed, and she looked at me the way a landlord looks at a tenant who is 3 weeks behind. "We need to talk about the living situation," she said. I was 63 years old. I had been sitting at that kitchen table, in that chair by the window, longer than Sandra had been alive. I had sat there when my wife Eleanor brought our son Thomas home from the hospital, a 7-pound 4-ounce boy who screamed through his first night and most of his second. I had sat there the morning I signed the divorce papers. I had sat there alone, drinking my dark roast with 2 sugars, the week after Eleanor moved out and took Thomas with her. But Sandra did not know any of that. And that was not her fault. It was simply the truth of things. "I'm listening," I said. She pulled out the chair across from me, not beside me, across, which told me everything about how this conversation was going to go, and she folded her hands on the table. She had nice hands. I'd always noticed that about her. Careful hands. "Tom and I have been talking," she said, "and we think it's time to formalize the arrangement. You've been staying here for 8 months now, and we think $2,500 a month is more than fair for the master bedroom and your use of the common areas." I looked at my coffee cup. There was a small chip on the rim, on the left side, from the time I'd knocked it against the faucet in 1998. Eleanor had wanted to throw it out. I'd kept it anyway. $2,500, I said. "That's the market rate for this neighborhood?" Tom did the research. I thought about the neighborhood. I had chosen it in 1989 because it was close to the school Thomas would eventually attend, and because the backyard was large enough for a dog, though we'd never gotten around to the dog. I had chosen this house because I'd wanted Thomas to have a yard. "And if I don't?" I asked. Sandra's expression didn't change. "Then we'd ask you to find alternative arrangements. We're not trying to be difficult, William. We just need to run our household properly." I looked out the window. The maple in the front yard was in its full October color, the kind of red-orange that you only get in Ontario in the second week of October, the kind that makes you remember why you stayed in this country through every February. I'd planted that maple. Thomas had been 4. I set my coffee cup down. "All right," I said. Sandra blinked. She'd expected an argument. People who rehearse conversations always expect the other person to follow the script they've written for them. "All right," she repeated. $2,500 seems reasonable," I said. "But I won't be staying, Sandra. If we're doing this formally, I'd rather find my own place. You don't have to." "I know I don't have to. I want to." I stood and rinsed my cup in the sink. "I'll be out by the end of the week." She opened her mouth and closed it again. I went upstairs to pack. "I need to tell you something about my son, so you understand what comes later. Thomas is a good man. I want to be clear about that before I say anything else. He is 35 years old. He works in financial planning in the annex. He coaches a minor hockey team on Saturday mornings, and he sends his mother flowers on her birthday, even though Eleanor and I have been divorced for 28 years, and she remarried a dentist from Oakville who is, by all accounts, a perfectly decent person. Thomas is a good man who grew up without his father, and that is on me, not on him. Eleanor and I separated when Thomas was 7. It wasn't a violent ending or a dramatic one. We had simply become 2 people who were better at living separately than together, and we both knew it, and the kindest thing we did for each other was to admit that before we spent another decade making each other miserable. Thomas stayed in Toronto with Eleanor. I moved north. He visited some summers, every other Christmas for a while, then less regularly as he got older, and summers meant hockey camps and friends and the natural gravity of teenage life. I drove down to Toronto for his graduation, his birthday when I could make it. We spoke on the phone. We were close in the way that fathers and sons can be close when geography and years have placed a distance between them that neither of them quite knows how to cross. What Thomas did not know, what he had no reason to know, because I had never brought him up, and I had never needed his help, was what I had built in the time between. I moved to Northern Ontario in 1996 with $40,000 in savings, a used pickup truck, and a piece of land on a lake north of Parry Sound that I'd bought for almost nothing because the previous owner wanted to sell quickly and the property had no road access. I spent the first 2 years building a road. I spent the next 5 building what would eventually become Callaway's Lodge. If you know anything about fishing in Ontario, you may have heard of it. We started with 4 cabins and a main lodge with a kitchen that seated 12. By 2008, we had 16 cabins and a dining hall that could seat 60, a full guiding service, a fly-in operation for the back lakes, and a reputation that had been written up in 3 national magazines and 1 American one. The lodge had been featured in a documentary about wilderness tourism in 2019. We had a 12-month waiting list for the peak weeks in July. I had a manager, Pete Arsenault, who had been with me since 2001 and who ran the day-to-day operations with the quiet competence of a man who loves what he does. I had a staff of 22 in the summer and 8 year-round. I had a set of books that would have surprised anyone who knew me only as the older man drinking coffee in a kitchen in Toronto. I had never talked about any of this with Thomas, not because I was hiding it, because it had never come up in a natural way, and because I am not a man who talks about money, and because I had learned somewhere along the way that the people who need to tell you what they have are usually the ones who are afraid you won't respect them without it. I did not need Thomas to respect my lodge. I needed him to respect me. He hadn't been doing a particularly good job of that lately. He came upstairs while I was folding shirts. Thomas stood in the doorway of the master bedroom, the bedroom that had been mine long before it was his, though I had never said that out loud, and he had the look on his face that he'd had as a child when he knew something had gone wrong, but hadn't yet decided whether to acknowledge it. "Sandra told me," he said. "I figured she would. Dad, you don't have to go." I kept folding. I had 3 flannel shirts, 2 pairs of heavier work pants, the good wool sweater Eleanor had given me in 1993, and that I had somehow never gotten rid of. "I know I don't have to, Thomas. I want to." She shouldn't have said it like that. I looked up at him. My son is a tall man, taller than me, with Eleanor's coloring and the set of his jaw that I recognized from photographs of my own father. He was standing with his arms crossed, which is what he does when he's uncomfortable but trying to appear otherwise. "How should she have said it?" I asked. He didn't answer that. "Thomas." I set the sweater down. "This is your house, yours and Sandra's. I signed it over to you 3 years ago because I wanted you to have it, and I meant that. But I'm not going to pay rent in a house I gave you, and I'm not going to pretend that this arrangement makes sense for anyone. It'll be better for all of us if I go." "Where are you going to go?" "I have a place." "What place?" "You can't afford." He stopped himself, had the grace to look embarrassed. "You were going to say I can't afford anything," I said. "I wasn't. You were." I went back to folding. "I'll be fine, Thomas. I have somewhere to go. I'll send you my number when I get settled." He stood there for another moment, and I could see him working through the options, whether to push, whether to call Sandra, whether to say something that might unsay the last hour, and then he did what Thomas has always done when he doesn't know what to do. He nodded, and he went back downstairs. I finished packing. I called Pete from the driveway. "She finally did it," Pete said. He had known this was coming. I had told him about the arrangement in August, when Thomas had first suggested I come stay for a while, and Pete had listened to the whole story, with the patience of a man who has guided fishermen through difficult water for 20 years. "She finally did it," I confirmed. "When do you want the cabin?" "I'll drive up tomorrow morning. Can you have it ready?" "It's been ready since August," Pete said. I had a feeling. Pete has good feelings. It's one of his more useful qualities. I sat in the driveway for a moment before starting the truck. The maple was still doing its October thing, red-orange in the late afternoon light. I had planted it for Thomas. I did not regret that. The tree was still a good tree regardless of what happened under it. I drove to a motel on the Queensway for the night, ate a mediocre club sandwich, and slept better than I had in 8 months. The drive up was the same as it always was. The city thinned out past Barrie, and somewhere north of Parry Sound, the landscape opened up in the way that it does. The rock and the water and the birch trees, going gold along the highway, and I felt the particular kind of relaxation that I have only ever felt in that specific piece of Ontario. It is not a feeling I can explain to someone who hasn't experienced it. It is something like recognition, something like coming back to a version of yourself that the city requires you to leave behind. The road into the property was 2 kilometers of gravel through the bush, and I had driven it so many times that my hands knew the curves without thinking about them. I came around the last bend, and the main lodge appeared above the lake. The log structure I had spent 2 years building with Pete and a crew of 4, the deep green metal roof that caught the morning light and threw it back at the water. Pete was waiting on the porch. He is 51, Pete, built like a man who has spent 30 years carrying things and paddling things and fixing things. He has a gray beard and the particular kind of calm that comes from being genuinely good at something. He handed me a coffee when I got out of the truck, dark roast, no mention of sugar or milk, because Pete pays attention, and we stood on the porch for a moment looking at the lake. 16 bookings confirmed for December, he said. The ice fishing package is sold out through February. Good. The Hendersons called about their anniversary trip in January. They want the main cabin again. Book them in. Already did. He looked at me sideways. Your cabin's stocked. Firewood's in. Thanks, Pete. You doing all right? I considered the question. The lake was flat and gray-blue in the October light, and there were 2 loons out past the dock doing whatever loons do in October, and the air smelled like cold water and pine and the particular freshness that only exists this far from a city. Better than I was yesterday, I said, and I meant it. I had been back at the lodge for 11 days when Thomas called. I was in the equipment shed with Pete, going over the snow machine maintenance schedule, when my phone rang. I looked at the screen and then looked at Pete, and Pete found something interesting to look at on the other side of the shed. Thomas, I said. There was a pause that told me he was somewhere Sandra wasn't. Dad, are you okay? Where are you? I'm fine. I'm at work. Another pause. At work? I didn't know you were still... Still what? Working. I thought you were retired. I looked at the lake through the shed's small window. The loons were gone. First frost was coming. I could feel it in the way the air sat still. What made you think that? I don't know. You never talked about, he stopped. Where are you working? I thought about how to answer that. Not because I wanted to be mysterious about it. I simply wasn't sure where to begin, and I have never been good at beginning in the middle of a story. Up north, I said. Doing what? I'll tell you when you come up. Come up where? Dad. I'll send you the address. Come when you can. Bring Sandra if she wants to come. I paused. Or don't bring Sandra. Either way. I heard him exhale. What is going on? Nothing is going on, Thomas. I just want you to see the place. That's all. He came on a Friday. Without Sandra. He drove up on his own in the Accord, and I watched from the main lodge porch as he came down the gravel road and pulled into the lot. He got out of the car and stood there for a moment, looking at the lodge, looking at the outbuildings, looking at the dock and the boats and the lake beyond, and I watched his face do something I had not seen it do in a long time. His face went very still. I went down the steps to meet him. He turned when he heard my boots on the gravel, and he looked at me the way you look at someone when you're revising something you thought you understood about them. It is not a comfortable look to receive. It is also, in its own way, not an unwelcome one. What is this? He said. Callaway's Lodge, I said. Northern Ontario's premier wilderness fishing destination, according to the Ontario Tourism Association in 2021, though I think that's a bit much. Thomas looked at the main lodge again. It is a substantial building. It is meant to be, because when you are asking someone to drive 4 hours north for a fishing trip, the lodge they arrive at needs to justify the drive. It has a stone fireplace that Pete and I built in the second summer, and a dining room with a view of the lake, and a porch that runs the full length of the front and faces west for sunsets. You built this, Thomas said. It was not quite a question. Started it in '98. It's grown some since then. He turned back to me. He looked the way he'd looked at 7 years old, when he discovered that the story he'd been told about something was not the complete story. Not angry, just recalibrating. You never told me, he said. You never asked what I was doing up here. He opened his mouth and closed it. That was fair, and he knew it was fair. Come inside, I said. Pete's got coffee on. I want to tell you about Pete and Thomas, because it matters. Pete had known Thomas since he was a teenager, from the occasional summer visits. He had watched Thomas grow up in the peripheral way that people watch children they don't see often enough, with a kind of fond, slightly mournful attention, aware that they're missing the connective tissue of everyday life. Pete had always liked Thomas. He had also always worried about him in the specific way that men who work with their hands worry about men who've grown up without learning to. Thomas sat at the kitchen table in the main lodge, the big harvest table that Pete and I had bought at an auction in Huntsville in 2003, and that had fed more fishermen than I could count. And he wrapped his hands around a coffee mug and looked out at the lake. "How long?" he asked. 27 years, I said. "And He paused. "It's doing well?" "It's doing well." He was quiet for a while. Pete had made himself scarce, which is one of Pete's more useful qualities. "The equipment doesn't maintain itself," Pete had said, and disappeared. "I didn't know," Thomas said finally. He wasn't making an excuse. He was stating a fact, and there was something in the way he said it that was the beginning of something else, an acknowledgement, maybe, or the start of one. "I know you didn't," I said. "That's on me as much as anyone. I'm not good at talking about what I have. Your grandfather was the same way. Sandra is going to." He stopped. "What is Sandra going to do?" He looked at me. "She thinks you don't have money, she said you were a burden." I let that sit for a moment. Outside, a whiskey jack landed on the porch railing and looked through the window with the complete lack of self-consciousness that birds have. "Is that what you think?" I asked. Thomas looked at his coffee. "No," he said, and then, more quietly, "But I didn't stop her from saying it." "No," I agreed. "You didn't." We sat with that. The whiskey jack flew off. The lake did what lakes do in October. It moved a little, reflecting the clouds. "I should have," Thomas said. "Yes, you should have." He nodded. His jaw was set the way mine gets when I'm working through something I don't particularly want to work through but know I have to. I know that jaw. I've seen it in the mirror. "I owe you an apology," he said. "Yes," I said. "You do." I did not say it's fine or don't worry about it, because it was not entirely fine, and I thought he deserved the respect of not being let off too easily. Fathers who forgive too quickly rob their sons of the chance to actually earn something. Thomas looked up. His eyes were bright in the way that men's eyes get when they are holding something back and not entirely succeeding. "I'm sorry, Dad, for letting it happen. For not—" He stopped and started again. "For not knowing who you were." I put my hand on the table, not on his hand, just on the table between us. "You know now," I said. Pete gave Thomas the walking tour that afternoon. I watched from the main porch as the two of them went down to the dock, Pete pointing out the new boat storage, Thomas listening with his hands in his jacket pockets. They walked the path along the lake's edge to where the back cabins sat in the trees. Pete would be telling him about the fly-in operation, the back lakes, the guiding service. Pete loves the lodge the way I love it, which is to say completely and specifically, the way you love things you built yourself. I sat on the porch and drank my coffee and thought about Eleanor, which I don't do often, but sometimes do when I'm sitting still. We had been wrong for each other in the particular way of two people who love each other but cannot share a life without grinding each other down. I did not blame her for taking Thomas to the city. The city was where she knew how to live, and Thomas needed a parent who knew how to live somewhere. I was learning in those years. I was figuring out what I was made of, and that is not a comfortable process to witness up close. I hoped she was well. I expected she was. Eleanor had always known how to be well. Thomas and Pete came back up the path 40 minutes later. Thomas was pointing at something across the lake and asking a question, and Pete was answering with the particular enthusiasm he gets when someone asks him something he knows the answer to. They were getting along. I had expected they would. That evening, after supper, Pete's elk chili, which is better than anything I've ever eaten in a restaurant, Thomas sat across from me in the lodge's main room by the stone fireplace, and we talked the way we hadn't talked in years. He told me about the hockey team. 3 of his kids were good enough to play rep, but 2 of them were from families who couldn't afford the fees, and Thomas had been quietly covering the difference for 2 seasons without telling their parents. I did not know this about him. It made me feel things I didn't have words for. I told him about the lodge's early years. The winter of 2000, when the access road washed out, and Pete and I had to bring in supplies by snowmobile for 6 weeks. The summer of 2004, when we'd had a black bear get into the kitchen 3 nights running and we'd finally had to call the ministry. The couple from Vancouver who'd come for their honeymoon in 2009 and now brought their children every summer, and had become the kind of guests who feel like friends. Thomas listened to all of it. He asked questions. He remembered things I'd said and connected them to other things I'd said, which is something you can only do when you're actually listening. Somewhere around 10 o'clock, he said, "The house in Toronto." I waited. "I want to understand what happened," he said. "You signed it over to me 3 years ago. You just gave it to me." "Yes." "Why?" "Because I wanted you to have it. Because I wasn't using it. Because I wanted you to have somewhere that was yours." He shook his head slowly. "And then Sandra, Thomas, she asked you to pay rent on a house you gave us." "She did." He pressed his hands flat on his knees. "That's not who I want to be," he said. It came out quiet and direct, the way things come out when someone has been sitting with them for a while. "I don't want to be the man who lets his wife ask his father to pay rent. I don't want to be the man who knew something was wrong and didn't say anything because it was easier not to." I looked at the fire. "I've been doing that for a while," he said. "Taking the easier thing. She runs things. Which is fine, she's good at it. But I've been letting her run things I should have been running myself." "Like what?" He thought about it. "Like the relationship with you." I didn't say anything. "She told me you were a financial burden before you even moved in," he said. "She said we needed to think about what our long-term responsibility to you was going to be. And I went along with it. I let her frame it that way without he looked up at me. You're not a burden, Dad. You've never been a burden. I was taking the easier thing. You were raised without knowing me well," I said. "That's not your fault. It's not an excuse either." "No," I said. "It's not." The fire popped. Outside, the temperature had dropped below zero and the first frost was forming on the dock boards. In a few weeks, the lake would start making its ice. The slow particular thickening that I had watched every November for 27 years. "What do I do?" Thomas asked. "About what?" "About Sandra. He waved a hand. "About all of it." I thought about this carefully, because my son was asking me a real question, and real questions deserve real answers, not comfortable ones. "You have a good marriage," I said. "Sandra is not a bad person. She is a person who makes decisions based on what she knows, and what she knew was that I was an older man with no visible income living in a bedroom that could have been a home office. She made a reasonable calculation based on incomplete information." Thomas looked at me with something complicated in his expression. "The problem," I continued, "is not Sandra. The problem is that you let her make decisions about your family without the information she needed to make them well. That is a problem between you and Sandra, and that is yours to fix." He was quiet for a long time. The fire settled. Pete had gone to his cabin an hour ago, and the lodge was quiet in the way that large buildings are quiet when they've been full all season and are now emptying out for the shoulder months. "You're not going to make this easy, are you?" Thomas said. "Would it help you if I did?" He almost smiled. "No." "Then there's your answer." He stayed the weekend. Saturday morning I took him out on the lake in the aluminum boat, the one I've had since 2002, and that I will probably have until the lake takes it back. We fished for walleye in the bay, where the rock structure drops off and the fish hold in October before the ice. Thomas had not fished in 20 years, since one of those teenage summers, and his first few casts were the casts of a man who has forgotten more than he remembered. By mid-morning he had remembered enough. We didn't talk much. We didn't need to. There is something that happens between people in a boat on a lake in October, something about the cold air and the silence and the shared attention to the water that does work that words can't do as efficiently. I had spent 30 years understanding this. I was glad to have my son understand it with me. He caught a walleye just before noon, a solid 2-pounder, and he held it up with the look on his face that people get when they've caught their first fish. In a long time, not triumph exactly, but something more like surprise, like the fish is confirmation of something they weren't entirely sure they still believed. "Nice fish," I said. He looked at it, and then he looked at me, and then he looked at the lake, and I think that was the moment something settled in him that had been unsettled for a while. "Pete's going to want to cook that," I said. "Pete can have it," Thomas said, "and let it go." Saturday evening, Sandra called. Thomas took the call outside on the porch, and I stayed by the fire, pretending to read a fishing magazine from 2019. I could hear the low murmur of his voice through the window, but not the words, which was appropriate. Some conversations belong only to the people having them. He came back in 20 minutes later. He sat back down across from me and looked at the fire for a while. I told her about the lodge, he said. I waited. She was quiet for a long time, he said. Then she said she didn't know. I told her that was the point. I told her she made a decision about you based on what she assumed, and what she assumed was wrong, and that I had let her make that decision. He paused. She didn't take that part particularly well. I'd have been surprised if she had, she said. He stopped. She asked if you were angry with her. Emmy? He looked at me. Are you? I thought about it genuinely. Sandra had done what she'd done, and it had stung in the way that things sting when they confirm a fear you've had quietly for a while. The fear that your own child has stopped seeing you as a person and has started seeing you as a problem to be managed. That stung. But Sandra was 33 years old, and she had done what 33-year-olds do, which is make decisions quickly based on the information they have without spending a great deal of time wondering what they might not know. No, I said. I'm not angry with her. She wants to apologize. She can do that whenever she's ready. There's no hurry. Thomas nodded slowly. She wants to come up. Next weekend, if that's all right. I looked at the fire. It's all right. Dad. Mem. The house. He turned his coffee mug in his hands. I want to talk about the house. What about it? It's your house. It was always your house. And he shook his head. I don't want it on those terms. The way things have been, I gave it to you, Thomas. It's yours. You gave it to me because you wanted me to have it, not so your daughter-in-law could ask you for rent. He met my eyes. If you ever want to use it, come back to it. You should be able to do that, without anyone asking you for anything. I thought about the maple tree in the front yard, the one I had planted when Thomas was 4, the chip in the rim of my coffee cup, the chair by the window. I appreciate that, I said. I mean it. I know you do. We sat with the fire for a while. Outside, the frost was heavy now. The dock boards white in the light from the porch. The lake was still. Why didn't you ever tell me? Thomas asked. Not accusatory. Genuinely curious in the way that people get curious, when they realize they've been missing a piece for a long time and have only now found where it was. I didn't know how to start, I said, and after a while it seemed I thought about how to say it. It seemed like if I told you, you might think I was telling you in order to impress you, or in order to make a point. And I didn't want to be that kind of father. What kind? The kind who needs his son to know what he's worth. Thomas was quiet for a moment. And now? Now it seemed like you needed to know. For different reasons. He nodded. He was looking at the fire, and the fire was doing what fires do, settling, shifting, throwing light on the things around it. I needed to know who you were, he said quietly. Not what you have, who you are. And now? I asked. The same question back to him. He looked at me. His jaw was set in the familiar way, but his eyes were clear. I think I'm starting to, he said. Sandra came up the following Saturday. She drove up with Thomas in the Accord, and she got out of the car and stood in the gravel lot, looking at the lodge, with an expression I recognized, the same recalibration I had seen on Thomas's face the week before, the same quiet revision happening behind the eyes. I went down the porch steps to meet them. She was a composed woman, Sandra. She did not try to hug me immediately, or perform warmth she wasn't feeling. She looked at me directly, which I respected, and she said, I owe you an apology, William. You do, I said. She blinked slightly. She'd expected a dismissal, or a reassurance. I had learned from Thomas that the easier thing is not always the better thing. I made assumptions about you, she said. I decided what you were before I knew who you were. And I said things, she stopped. I said things to Thomas about you that weren't right, and I should have talked to you, instead of around you. Yes, I said. She waited. Sandra, I said, you're not a bad person. You're a person who made a decision with incomplete information. I understand that. What I want is for it not to happen again, for us to know each other properly. That's all I want from you. She exhaled a small, controlled exhale. I'd like that, she said. Good. I looked at Thomas over her shoulder. Pete made bannock this morning. Come inside before it gets cold. She was good with Pete. That was the thing I hadn't known to hope for, and it turned out to be true. Pete is not a man who makes conversation easily with people he doesn't know, but he is a man who responds to genuine curiosity. And Sandra was genuinely curious about the lodge, about how it worked, about the guiding operation, about the logistics of running a business this far from a city. She asked good questions. Pete gave good answers. By lunch, they were talking about the difficulties of staffing seasonal businesses in remote areas, which is a subject Pete could discuss for approximately 6 hours without stopping. Thomas sat beside me at the big harvest table and watched his wife and my manager talk fishing tourism, and there was something in his face that I recognized as relief, the particular relief of watching two things that matter to you get along. "She's not who I thought she was," he said quietly, not loud enough for Sandra to hear. "She might say the same about you," I said. He looked at me. "People become who they think they're supposed to be," I said, "in whatever environment they're in. Sandra was in an environment where she thought you needed managing and protecting. She became a person who managed and protected. You were in an environment where you thought the easiest thing was the best thing. You became a person who took the easy thing." I picked up my coffee. "That can change. For both of you. You sound like you've thought about this a lot." "I've had 11 days with very little else to do." That made him laugh, which was good. Thomas's laugh is genuine, a quick, full thing that doesn't leave anything behind. He got that from Eleanor. She always had a good laugh. After lunch, Thomas asked if he could take one of the boats out. I gave him the keys to the aluminum boat and watched from the dock as he got it started and headed out toward the bay, not fishing, just moving on the water. Sandra stood beside me on the dock. "He loves it here," she said. "He hasn't been here enough to love it yet," I said, "but I think he might." She was quiet for a moment. The lake moved in the particular restless way it moves in late October, the surface running before a northwest wind. "I didn't know you built this," she said. "Most people don't. Why didn't you tell anyone?" I watched the aluminum boat make its way across the bay. Thomas was moving slowly, not going anywhere in particular, just going. "I had everything I needed up here," I said. "I didn't need anyone to know about it. Until now, I thought about that. Until Thomas needed to," I said. They stayed until Sunday afternoon. When they left, Sandra hugged me in the gravel lot in a way that was still a little careful but was entirely genuine, and I thought, there she is. There is the person who was inside the composed, managing exterior all along. A careful person, a real one. Thomas shook my hand and then pulled me into a hug, which he has not done since he was a teenager, and I let it happen and was glad it did. "Come down for Christmas," he said, "if you want." "I might," I said. "If Pete can manage without me for a few days." "I can manage without you for a week," Pete said from the porch, not looking up from the reel he was restringing. "I manage without you all winter." Thomas laughed. Sandra smiled. I raised a hand at Pete, who waved back without looking up. I watched them drive back up the gravel road and disappear into the bush, the dust settling behind the car in the cold air. Pete came down from the porch. "Well," he said. "Well," I said. "Bannoc's still warm if you want some." We went back inside. The fire had settled down to good coals. Through the window, the lake was silver under a high, overcast sky, and the birch on the far shore had dropped most of their leaves, leaving the white trunks standing clean against the dark spruce. It was the kind of landscape that had taken me 27 years to know properly, the kind you can only know by staying, by watching the same water in every season, until you understand what it looks like from the inside rather than from a distance. I poured my coffee dark roast, 2 sugars, and sat in the chair by the window. Outside, the first snow of the season had begun to fall, small and quiet, settling on the dock and on the water and on the empty boats, making everything briefly the same color, briefly equal, the way the first snow always does before the world remembers its distinctions. I sat there and watched it come down, and I thought about my son in his car somewhere on the highway south, and his wife in the passenger seat beside him, and the maple tree in the front yard of a house in Toronto that I had planted for a 4-year-old boy, who was now a man I was, slowly beginning to know. It was not a bad way to be 63. It was not a bad way to be anything.